Welcome to Global Grit Conversations, where resilience, leadership, and impact meet across borders. I'm Pamela Campagna, Global Advisor, Professor, and founder of Blue Sage Consulting. In each episode, we talk with leaders, entrepreneurs, and changemakers who have turned challenges into growth and share practical strategies along the way. This is Global Grit Conversations. Thomas Sullivan to Global Grit Conversations. Very excited to have you here today and to hear a bit about your journey in a number of different areas of your personal and professional life. So welcome.
Pam, it's a real pleasure to do this with you. And as always, you're up to really great stuff.
Great, thank you. Maybe just to warm up a bit and to start, I know you've had a couple of different careers maybe in your life so far. So maybe you can walk us through a bit of where you started and what you're doing these days.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And Pam, I think I was thinking about the topic that you're doing, which is really interesting, and getting people focused on understanding what supported people or what initiated the transitions, and what about them enabled them to sustain themselves through transitions. And I think that's a really great topic. I remember as I was thinking about it and that topic, I think back to being very young, and I remember I had gone to college for my freshman year, and I played soccer. And I was a kind of a walk-on. I made the team. Unfortunately, the coach didn't think I was as good a player as I thought I was. I remember I had a summer business where I painted houses, and after my freshman year, I was painting a house, and I'm scraping away on the side of the house, and all of a sudden I had thought, why am I in college? And I couldn't answer that question. I didn't have a real purpose behind it other than soccer. And so I thought about it a little bit more, and then I remember telling my parents, I'm not going to go back to college. They were not as happy as I was. But I remember what I decided to do was I took the money that I had earned from my painting business. I gave it to my mother, and I left my house with $25 in my pocket. And I hitchhiked around the country. I didn't know where I was going to go. I didn't know what was going to happen. This was pre-cell phone. So, one asset that I had is I had a tremendous sense of adventure, and I was willing to embrace adventure. And that certainly was an adventure. Wasn't quite the adventure that I always wanted it to be, but it was definitely an adventure. I ended up in San Francisco. So I left from Boston. I went up north. I went into Canada. I came back down. I hitchhiked across the country. Ended up in San Francisco. I ended up selling produce from the side of Golden Gate Park. And I lived in San Francisco for a year. And then I went back to school after that year and hitchhiked my way across the country as well on the way back. Went through Canada on this one. So, I have had a sense of adventure that I think has been important to me. There's something about, stepping into something novel that is interesting and exciting, right? As I started to get into a professional life, I was kind of at a crossroads. I don't think I ever had a clear path in front of me. And when I think, one of the things that was really formative for me in my early 20s after going to school was being introduced to the work of Werner Erhard and taking a course called The Forum that, was just an eye-opener for me, thinking about the power of being able to see yourself in particular ways and see yourself in particular. One of the things that really sticks out to me about Erhard is, how much we stop ourselves from taking steps forward, from taking risks for lots of different reasons. And I learned some important things about a willingness to look bad, not be stopped by the fear of looking bad, a willingness to be wrong, not be dedicated to being right. I still work on that to this day, but I think I'm pretty strong in being able to see my contribution to the way things go. And that has always served me. And I remember I had ended up working for Peter Senge's company that was called Innovation Associates. And I basically came in to do sales with them. And, there was a certain point where I realized just don't want to do a job. I really do want to have an impact. And at that point, I kind of wedged my way into consulting. And it wasn't a logical path, but I wedged my way into it. It was not easy. It was kind of a brutal path. So I wish I had had an MBA when I did that, but I didn't. And so it involved a lot of learning, involved a lot of failure, and getting a lot of coaching. And one of the things that sustained me in that, was surrounded with a lot of really great people, and people who who had a willingness to bring me along, a willingness to invest in me. And that was really helpful. Michael Goodman at Innovation Associates, Robert Hanig, really great people and great colleagues over the years.
So it sounds like you've kind of combined a bit of firsthand experience with your travels and kind of pulling yourself up from your bootstraps and exploring a bit, and then applying some of that in a more formalized structure, working with Peter Senge and the work and the research that that they've done. And how have you taken some of this hands-on experience and then formalize that in, say, education? We met over a decade ago teaching at a university. So do you see any sort of connection there?
If I think about that kind of transition, one thing I would say, working for Senge and Senge's work all around the kind of systems view of organization and a learning organization view was really fascinating. It was great to learn, great to be immersed in that in an environment of learning. And, just the notion of that naturally leads into education. It naturally leads into, in particular, we did a lot of work in the implementation of change in organizations. And a lot of that work that made, at that time, Innovation Associates and Senge's work kind of unique was, you really had to work on the change agents, that is the leaders, to be able to effectively guide change. I would just say one other thing. So, sort of kind of my sense of adventure that was helpful is, I didn't have the right pedigree to go into the work that I was doing. I still don't have a terminal degree as a faculty member, but I've, been named Faculty of the Year multiple times.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I don't think I've ever had the comfort of confidence in myself in that way, right? In that pedigree. I think I think what is, but I do have comfort in uncertainty, not knowing where to go and not knowing what to do. I do have a confidence that I can figure that out, right? And so, that sometimes puts me in positions where I really couldn't figure it out, and it's been tough. And sometimes that's put me in positions where, yes, I can. But that willingness to step into that territory, I think, has been helpful. And that transition into working as a faculty member at HULT, came from somebody saying, "Hey, HULT's going to try something new and different with the leadership curriculum," and they want it to be, an integral part, not just a course or two. Then I got excited about that and that ability to have impact and to have impact on people's careers.
And so being able to try different things and focusing on having that impact, that sounds like a real common theme throughout your life. Pursuing things maybe that you're passionate about or maybe you're interested in, and then become passionate about, and then learning along the way.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's very true. And I think, there's a relationship between that and thinking about working in teams, and the emphasis that absolutely in my teaching that has had is there's something just like, it's intoxicating at times, Pam, to step into potential in a situation, to see what's possible, and to be willing to go into that future with that uncertainty as well. There's no guarantee anything is going to work out, but when you can see potential, when you can see possibility together, it's such a galvanizing force, and it can really propel people into different situations.
And it's energizing when you're bringing other people along with you, like students, right?
Exactly. I specific to that, another kind of pivot point for me that has had sort of two parallel careers over the last few years was I through some of the leadership work I was doing in consulting, I got to know somebody named Reverend Jeffrey Brown, who has been at the forefront of, in Boston and nationally, it's known as community-based violence reduction efforts. And he's got a great TED Talk if you ever want to see it. If you want to Google Reverend Jeffrey Brown and the Boston Miracle TED Talk, his work, of course, it's a pastor, and they did incredible work in reducing violence in the city of Boston by unique ways. And Boston continues to be the safest, or among the very, very, very safest cities in the United States, because his work has endured. And he and I got to know each other, and we would have long conversations, and I would be curious about the work that he does and how he did his work. And I noticed something, as I listened to him talk about his work, and I noticed how different Boston as a city had become. And I started talking to him about it. Jeff, your chance to scale your work is now. Your ability to scale your work is limited by, your budget. And your budget is dependent on a lot of different factors that you don't control. But your work, peace work, produces enormous economic value. And I said, we should really think about how could you get the ability to capture some of that economic value and scale your work. And through many conversations, we talked this over, and we decided to form a company called My City at Peace. And it is a for-profit company. And what we ended up doing was realizing, there's terrible data around this, but we realized that there's a way you can kind of put a dollar value on human life, because when homicides go down in an area, property values go up. And so we were looking at that, and we then said, real estate seems like the right place to go. And we ended up having, and neither he nor I have a real estate background, but we ended up having, probably 100 conversations in which we engage with people who have business in real estate to pitch our idea about how we could help them. We did a project in Chicago in the former Henry Horner housing project. It's, Chicago had some notorious housing projects. Henry Horner was one, Cabrini Green was another in the 80s and 90s. But a developer had redone Henry Horner and wanted us to work with them. So we worked with them as consultants, but we wanted to really get into how do you address real estate from the owner side. We, again, had hundreds of conversations. We ended up having one pivotal conversation with a guy named Tom O'Brien, whose company is called HYM Investments. And he's probably the biggest developer in the city of Boston. And he said, yes, let's find a way to work together. And this was a time when the Boston Federal Reserve had just come out with a study that compared relative family wealth in the Boston area. And when they cut the data by race, they found out that white families on average had net family wealth of $247,000. And Black families had $8 of net family wealth. That's not a typo. $8 versus $247,000. And, that's a systemic indication of something really wrong. And so we started thinking about that, and we looked into the data, and, the largest and historically Black neighborhood of Boston, Roxbury, is 80% rental units. There isn't ownership at the level there is in other parts of the city. And so we started focusing on that. What can we do to impact the level of home ownership as a for-profit company? And so we've won a project, the right to develop a big lot of land in the city of Boston, and we're in the process of doing it. It's harder than I thought it was going to be to get the project off the ground, but we are continuing to push through.
So it sounds as though you've had your hands in a number of different projects, Tom, and maybe one of the things that kind of pulls you into these projects is passion for something or having an impact. It sounds like, and one of the aspects that we talk about in the podcast is trying to understand how people approach or deal with different challenges that you've come across. And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but can you maybe give us some examples of setbacks that you've had maybe, and any pivotal moments, any real inflection points? How have you handled them, and what have they meant to your personal and professional career?
There are many, and there are many times that I've failed. And, sometimes I've failed on delivering for a client in a consulting gig. Sometimes I've failed in conversations. I don't think I ever have those failures without doing deep introspection afterwards and trying to understand what I did to have that go wrong, how I did that. I think I always try and learn from it. You know, I do have lots of scars, and I think the lessons have been learned the hard way. I don't, in retrospect, there are many different ways I could have learned some of the lessons I did. If I think back to just the transition from doing sales to do consulting in the days of Innovation Associates, I would say, that was tough. It was hard to do. I didn't know what I didn't know. I think what I did continue to do, and I think I continue to do this, is become, sort of a dedicated learner. And so I read a ton, I study a ton, I think about it a ton.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about, I know you've had experience working cross-culturally, teaching students from around the world. What are some of the insights that you've had in those experiences?
When I was working for Innovation Associates, we got acquired by Arthur D. Little, and that changed the nature of the clients that we ended up working with. And it shifted from mostly US to an international kind of feel. And again, my sense of adventure threw me into situations where I shouldn't have been. I said, yeah, I can work in Spanish. I had traveled a bit in Latin America. I had, a rudimentary grasp of the language, and I could communicate. But when I got assigned to projects, I said, wait a second, I need to do something to get ready. And so I did, probably at different times, I did 1-2 week immersion in Spanish. And then after that, every year for a couple of years, I did a week of immersion in Spanish as I was working in Spanish. And, so taking notes, thinking in Spanish, listening carefully in Spanish. I definitely got myself into situations where I felt over my head. And again, that just made me dive deeper into trying to learn, trying to gain. And now, not only am I fluent, but my wife is Mexican. I met her in Mexico City. I worked in Spain. I worked in Mexico. I worked in, across Latin America. I've worked in all of those countries. And I remember there was one time where there was a project that I got. This was as my Spanish was on the upswing right before I started doing a lot of work in Mexico. And the project was out of Harvard. It was out of the School of Education at Harvard, and they wanted somebody who could bring a systemic perspective to a session that they were running about. It was about El Salvador, and it was El Salvador in the few years after the end of the official declared end of the war, in the civil war in El Salvador. The World Bank was about to underwrite an education grant or loan for $100 million, and they wanted Congress to be behind this loan. And so they said, the School of Ed got involved at Harvard, and they brought in politicians from the two parties. They brought in people from civil society. They brought in educators, and they brought in the Secretary of Education to this session. There were 30 people, and for 10 days, I facilitated a session in Spanish, generating insight. There were certain speakers who came in and talked about public education and where it's going. Harvard brought in experts, but my job was to facilitate a conversation, generating a consensus around education. And the consensus had to be derived from people who were, I remember this one woman who was the vice president of Congress, and she came from the FMLM party, which were the opposing fighters before the peace. And so she was known before she came into Congress. She was known as Subcomandante Norma. She was in the military. So it was like that group, and then the people that represented the establishment and the history. And how do you bring them together to have a consensus around this particular view of education and what they were going to use the money for? It was exhausting and exhilarating, and a chance to have an impact. And they left, and when they voted on the budget after this, it was a month later, the education spending bill was the only thing that got unanimous agreement in the Congress. So it was successful, and
It's incredible.
but that was really hard. Those conversations were frankly, for the most part, I could understand, but there was plenty of nuance and plenty that I didn't get.
Well, not to mention the dynamic and the
Yes,
context and
all of that.
right.
And I had to learn. So I had to learn in the moment, on the fly. I would go home and I would have a headache every night. And I'd come back in the next day, so, and we were doing it at the School of Ed, so it was in Harvard Square. That's an example of where I took on something that, sort of my grasp exceeded my ability. But I grabbed it and I held on to it, and I persisted. I sought advice where I could. I tried to get, whenever there was a break or downtime, I tried to understand what was really happening, and it, it just went great.
Addressing the fear. So just jumping in, recognizing that maybe it's something new, you haven't done it before, but being willing to try.
I had said at the beginning, one of the things I never have had is the comfort of confidence. I like going into that. I was always on my toes, and I think that helps me. But there's lots of times where I wish I was confident.
Maybe it's just a different type of confidence. Maybe your definition of confidence is different than the aspiration of, what does confidence look like to you? Does it look like stepping into something, doing something without reservation, without thinking, without fear, without doubt? Is that what confidence looks like to you, or is it something else?
No, I suppose it might be. It's interesting that I've decided to use the word comfort of confidence, comfort with that. I think it has to do with like feeling comfortable going into situations. And I think, I don't seek that all the time, but I think I watch other people and I think they have a certain confidence and comfort with where they are that I often don't feel.
And how much of what we're talking about, I know there's something behind your head on your whiteboard that you wanted to talk about a little bit. How much of this has been influenced by some experiences that you've had? And in particular, what is that? What is that item behind you?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that I get myself into that I have never done before, like real estate, becoming more of a professional academic at Hult and starting to do some research and doing things like that, or, things I haven't done before. And so, I like that. And I like that I can continue to do that. I'm not sure where this fits in, Pam, but the reason I have this up here is, I keep it on my whiteboard in my home office. This is Lord of the Rings, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan. This is Éowyn, who is the only female rider of Rohan in the Lord of the Rings stories. And there's a great scene in which she, in the movie and in the book as well, she stands before the Nazgul, which is sort of like the evil dragon and the dragon lord, and defends her king. And she stands, before this thing that's crushed everybody else on the path. And she says, "You will not touch him." Right. And I always still get a little bit emotional about that. And because it reminds me of my daughter, and my daughter standing up to, forces that are, crushing forces to her. And this happened because when she was 8 years old, she's now 23. She's about to graduate from college, which is just a blessing. But when she was 8, she suffered a near drowning. And when she suffered that near drowning, um, it was touch and go. There's no guarantee that she was going to survive this. And and she was in a coma. It's a medically induced coma. First, a regular kind of non-responsiveness, but a medically induced coma to keep her brain from swelling and all sorts of things. And she was in that coma for 10 or 12 days. I can't remember. We were in the pediatric ICU in the University of Texas, San Antonio, which was unbelievable people and unbelievable care. But when she came out of the coma, this is not like the light switch now goes on. The light switch was off. The light switch goes on. No, this was like she had been 8 and now she was a newborn. Literally a newborn. We didn't know if she could walk. We didn't know if she could talk. We didn't know, anything. And my daughter, had suffered a traumatic brain injury, and it has influenced and changed the trajectory of her life incredibly. But what I take as inspiration and as just the best I can take from this situation is to watch her, and her life has been more difficult than most of her peers by far, right? So she had to learn to walk again. She had to learn to talk again. She had to learn to do everything. And, her path was tough, but she has never complained about what happened to her. She's never stopped working. She does the hard work. She's courageous. And so, I keep this up to remind me of her and to remind me of me. That's who I am too. And that's who I aspire to be, is courageous in the moments that matter, to be somebody who never gives up, and to carry on. So I just keep that up there, just because, life throws you lots of circumstances that test you, and they test, are you truly courageous? Are you truly somebody who will stay with it? And she reminds me of that all the time. Right. And she's somebody who cares and asks for help too.
And asking for help, so important. What advice, Tom, would you have for any of the listeners who might be facing unexpected obstacles or difficult transitions in their own lives? Any advice that you would have?
It's a hard thing to say that would be universally applicable, I think, for but anybody in particular. But I think in those moments, what was really helpful for us immediately afterwards is accepting help from everybody around us, right? Uh, and and to realize, that to step through the difficult moments, yes, you're the one who has to be moving forward. And you can do it with, many hands behind you, right? Many hands supporting you. Um, and I think, one of the things that's been really important and helpful for me, um, is to not diminish the pain of the situation. There's tremendous grief in being a parent, and I can't imagine what it's like to have your child die. I know what it felt like to have my daughter have near death and not know if she was alive. But then to be in the daily part of, my daughter isn't who she once was, right? Uh, and that's, that continues to this day. Um, and to realize, that's part of it, that will never not be there. Um, it doesn't mean that I don't see the kind of miracle of her recovery, and I'm deeply grateful for that. But it means I don't move away from the pain, right? The pain is there. It's okay to have that pain. And I need to move forward.
I mean, it's a choice, right? So what I'm hearing you say is that in your own journey, there was a moment that you could have gone in a completely different direction. So you had a choice as to how you would react over time to the situation that your family was in. And you made a choice. That was a consequential choice for how you would react and how you would handle and how you would continue on, how you would look back on this situation 15 years later. And that choice has made a difference to how you live with it today, right?
Yeah. And I think for anybody encountering a situation like this, and I think it is applicable beyond a particular medical emergency like this. I think it's applicable to lots of different situations. But, one thing that I came out of this with was, my daughter happened to get stuck at the bottom of a pool and she could not free her hand and we couldn't get her out. And, what I came out of that realizing was like, we're 1/4 an inch away from disaster all the time. We're just not aware that we're 1/4 of an inch. Things can go wrong like that. And one of the important things for me, I know this, is no assignation of blame, right? No, I did not blame anybody for what happened. I wasn't there. My wife was there. She tried to save my daughter. It must have been horrific. I know it was horrific for her, but it's never been, why didn't you save her? Why, never been that way. It's been, this is what life is like. We're this close all the time, and things happen. And, so now that it's happened, what's next? Right. And I think that's just a really important thing for me is, this is what happened. Yeah.
Any final comments, suggestions for listeners? Anything that you've learned along the way that sticks in your mind that you'd like to share with us?
I think to this day, still get excited about things that I can do that I think are going to be fun for me and impactful. And that is helpful for me. Campus at Hult, for example, there's 3 different global campuses. And I have pitched this idea of, with the World Cup coming up, can we do an inter-campus competition? Who can pick the winning football team for the World Cup in 2026? And so that just seems fun to me. I've gotten the head of school to say yes and create a cup and do a competition. And I do that just because I think it would be fun and something worth doing. Yeah.
So looking at keeping it fun. I like that. Well, thank you, Thomas Sullivan. I so appreciate your willingness to spend your time today with us talking about your experiences, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Excellent, Pam. Really a pleasure. You're always up to fantastic stuff, and it's always a joy and a pleasure to work with you.
Thanks for tuning in today to Global Grit Conversations. We hope today's conversation has offered insights that you can use in your own journey. Subscribe for future episodes with leaders who are shaping industries around the world. And until next time, keep leading with purpose and turning grit into growth.